Hello and welcome to the Credible Faith Show. I'm your host, Dr. Paul D. Larson, and in this episode we'll be looking at part 3 of the section Preparatory Considerations of the classic apologetics work of William Paley, A View of the Evidences of Christianity. Without much more said, let's dive right into the reading. But if the object is worthy and the necessity clear, the power is in existence, and the will to exert it is just as probable as that a revelation should be given to us at all. For, in any way you choose to take it, a revelation must be made by miracle. If any information come from God to man, which the highest human endowments could never have attained, it must come otherwise than by the simple operation of the laws of the human mind. These laws, however, need not be violated in the process. Neither reason, nor conscience, nor will require to be set aside. Not by doing violence to the operation of those powers, but by the extraordinary operation of the divine mind upon and through them, the requisite information may be communicated. And this is a miracle. It is direct intervention of the Almighty, and not the result of any natural law. The discovery is not made by human genius, or reason, or intellect, but by divine disclosure, even as Paul says of his own inspiration, quote, I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which I preached unto you is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. End quote. Galatians chapter 1, verses 11-12. To allege, therefore, that a miracle is impossible is to allege that even though God should desire to make a revelation to his creatures, he could not accomplish his desire. Will this conclusion be maintained by anyone except an atheist? If God himself speaks to the people as on Mount Sinai, that surely is a miracle. If God inspires a prophet or apostle to speak for him, that is a miracle. If God commissions evangelists to communicate new expressions of his will to mankind, they must have power to prove that he is with them, and thereby authenticates their message as divine. This last position may be illustrated by a remark made to the editor by two of the leaders of the Spiritual Manifestation Party, which has recently established an organization in the city of New York. The remark was this, quote, it is useless to visit speaking or writing, quote, mediums, end quote, in the hope of being convinced of the truth of our claims. You must be a witness to the physical phenomena, the table movements and other singular occurrences, such as Judge Edmonds had detailed in the introduction to his book, and which were the means of his own conversion, end quote. Now these, quote, physical phenomena, end quote, are their miracles, the facts to which they appeal in proof of a real spiritual agency. They do not rest for primary conviction upon the revelations themselves, but upon the initiatory marvels of their system, which they allege as evidence of a power and intelligence whose existence cannot be accounted for except on the ground of intercourse between the living and the dead. The internal evidence may be satisfactory to one who already believes, but the skeptic is referred to the external manifestations. These, it is maintained, are the deeds of departed spirits and not of living men. In truth, they are not such acts as one would expect the Most High God to perform. They bear but a sorry comparison with the signs and wonders of the Bible. Still, the use that is made of them serves to illustrate the necessity of miracles, or of such works as God alone can do, in order to authenticate a revelation from him. Our limits, however, forbid us to enlarge farther upon the subject. If the reader is not contented with Paley's plain and practical view of miracles, let him peruse Dr. Wardlaw on miracles. New York, Carter and Brothers, 1853. This work, like that of Dr. Hitchcock, already referred to, is at once a manual and a catalogue on the modern state of the question which it discusses. Besides consulting the authors to whom Dr. W. alludes, let him also read Professor Babbage's 9th Bridgewater Treatise, an essay abounding in profound thought and ingenious argument. Dr. Hitchcock's work likewise contains much valuable matter on miracles. The connection between miracles and revelation is thus stated by Dr. Wardlaw, pages 49 through 54. Quote, when such miracles are wrought in connection with any commission professedly received from God, or with any testimony alleged to have his authority, there cannot, with any ingenuous mind, be the slightest difficulty in discerning the relation between the one and the other, or the nature of the evidence borne by the miracle to the commission or the testimony. Every such mind will be ready, with Nicodemus, to say, regarding him in support of whose commission, or of whose testimony they are wrought, quote, "We know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles which thou doest, except God be with him." End quote. In every such case, it requires but the capacity of a child to see that they are the direct and unequivocal seal of heaven to the commission, or to the testimony, of him who possesses the seal and can thus show its impress. I can imagine nothing more perverse, or more futile, than to put such a question as, what connection can there be between any fact whatever and the truth of a doctrine? In one sense, it may at once be granted, there is and can be none. Truth, considered abstractly, does not at all depend upon evidence. If a proposition be true, it has the attribute of truth in itself, independently of all evidence. Evidence, everyone must see, does not make it true, it only shows it to be true. And it shows it to be true only to those who before were ignorant of its truth. And in this view, the connection of the evidence with the truth is much too simple to be capable of being perverted by any sophistry. If a man announces himself as having been commissioned by God to propound a certain doctrine, or system of doctrines, as from him, and for the truth of his commission and his communication, appeals to works such as no power but that of God can effect, if, upon his making this appeal, these works are instantly and openly done at his bidding, there is no evading of the conclusion that this is a divine interposition at the moment, in attestation of the authority he claims, and of the truth of what is declared. The professed divine ambassador says, quote, "This is from God," end quote. And God, by the instant intervention of the miracle, sets his seal to it. Says, as by a voice from heaven, if not even more decisively, quote, "It is from me," end quote. The sole questions requiring to be answered, in order to the legitimacy of the conclusion, are these two. Quote, "Is the work one which God alone can do?" End quote, and, quote, "Is it actually done?" End quote. If these questions are settled in the affirmative, there is no reasonable ground on which the conclusion can be withstood. You will further have observed that I have represented miracles as attesting the one or the other of two things, either a divine commission in general, or the truth of any particular article in the communication made. It is in the former of these two lights that the words of Nicodemus present them, as evidences of commission. Quote, "We know that thou art a teacher come from God," end quote. And in the same light, our Lord himself, on various occasions, appeals to them. Quote, "The works which the Father hath given me to finish, the same works that I do bear witness of me that the Father hath sent me," end quote. On the other hand, when Jesus said to the Jews, quote, "But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins," end quote, and then, as a proof of this particular fact or truth, commanded the paralytic to, quote, "Rise, take up his bed, and walk," end quote. We have an exemplification of the second of the two lights in which we have said miracles may be regarded. The miracle having been wrought in immediate connection with that one position was the direct divine attestation of its truth. Another observation still requires to be made, that is, more pointedly, for it has already been alluded to. I mean that in the working of a miracle, there is, in every case, a direct and immediate interference of deity. There is no transference of power from God to the divinely commissioned messenger. Neither is there any committing of divine omnipotence to his discretion. The former is, in the nature of the thing, impossible. It would be making the creature for the time almighty, and that, since omnipotence can belong to none but to divinity, would be equivalent to making him God. And the latter, were it at all imaginable, would neutralize and nullify the evidence, inasmuch as it would render necessary to its validity a previous assurance of the impeccability of the person to whom the trust was committed. that is, an assurance and an absolute one of the impossibility of its being ever perverted by the improper application of the power to purposes foreign to those of his commission. Omnipotence placed at a creature's discretion is indeed as real an impossibility in the divine administration as the endowing of a creature with the attribute itself. For, in truth, if the power remains with God, it would amount to the very same thing as God's subjecting himself to his creature's arbitrary and capricious will. There is, strictly speaking, in any miracle, no agency but that of the divine being himself. Even to speak of the messenger as his instrument is not correct. All that the messenger does is to declare his message and to appeal to God for its truth. And if, at his word, intimating a miracle is about to be performed in proof of it, the miracle actually takes place, there is, on his part, in regard to the performance, neither agency nor instrumentality, unless the mere utterance of words, an intimation of what is about to be done, or an appeal to heaven and a petition for its being done, may be so called. God himself is the agent, the sole and immediate agent. And there is, in connection with the miracle of power, a miracle of knowledge, consisting in such a secret supernatural communication between the mind of God and the mind of his servant, as imparts to the latter the perfect assurance that God will, at the moment, put forth the necessary power, that he certainly will strike in with his miraculous attestation. Failing this, the professed divine messenger must be set down as an impostor, and is alleged a message given to the winds. If, indeed, for his impiety and presumption, the divine being, whom, if he could, he would have made a liar, does not, in jealousy for the glory of his name, strike in another way, and instead of miraculously attesting the divinity of the message, execute supernatural and summary vengeance on the messenger. It may, then, we presume, be considered as admitted that on the supposition of miracles, quote, works which no man can do unless God be with him, end quote, being bona fide wrought, they do constitute a satisfactory evidence, an evidence which there is no rebutting, of a commission or a testimony being from God. One of the most eminent of the opposers of the divinity of the Bible in our own country, to whose reasonings we shall have occasion, by and by, very specially to advert, the celebrated historian and philosopher David Hume, never makes this a question. He denies that real miracles ever have been wrought. We shall see on what ground, but he never at all disputes the point that, if actually wrought, they would have been conclusive proofs of divine authority. And in spite of a little occasional skeptical speculation on the part of some whose desire makes a near approach to atheism, such is the general and reasonable belief. The grand inquiry is, have they been wrought? Which amounts to the same thing with, have we, by whom they have not been witnessed, sufficient evidence on which to found our conviction of their having been wrought? It is evident that we can have no solid ground for our faith of the attested doctrine unless we have sufficient ground for our faith in the miracles by which their attestation is alleged to have been given. End quote. To this statement we subjoin that of Principal Hill, Lectures on Divinity, volume Roman numeral 1, pages 54 through 59. Quote, by experience and information, we are able to trace a certain regular course, according to which the Almighty exercises his power throughout the universe, and all the business of life proceeds upon the supposition of the uniformity of his operations. We are often, indeed, reminded that our experience and information are very limited. Extraordinary appearances at particular seasons astonish the nations of the earth. New powers of nature unfold themselves in the progress of our discoveries, and the accumulation of facts collected and arranged by successive generations serves to enlarge our conceptions of the greatness and the order of that system to which we belong. But although we do not pretend to be acquainted with the whole course of nature, yet the more that we know, we are the more confirmed in the belief that there is an established course, and every true philosopher is encouraged by the fruit of his own researches to entertain the hope that some future age will be able to reconcile with that course appearances which his ignorance is at present unable to explain. Although the business of life and the speculations of philosophy proceed upon the uniformity of the course of nature, yet it cannot be understood by those who believe in the existence of a supreme intelligent being that this uniformity excludes his interposition whensoever he sees meet to interpose. We use the phrase laws of nature to express the method in which, according to our observation, the Almighty usually operates. We call them laws because they are independent of us, because they serve to account for the most discordant phenomena, and because the knowledge of them gives us a certain command over nature. But it would be an abuse of language to infer from their being called laws of nature that they bind him who established them. It would be recurring to the principles of atheism, to fate and blind necessity, to say that the author of nature is obliged to act in the manner in which he usually acts, and that he cannot, in any given circumstances, depart from the course which we observe. The departure, indeed, is to us a novelty. We have no principles by which we can foresee its approach, or form any conjecture with regard to the measure and the end of it. But if we conceive worthily of the ruler of the universe, we shall believe that all these departures entered into the great plan which he formed in the beginning, that they were ordained and arranged by him, and that they arise at the time which he appointed, and fulfill the purposes of his wisdom. There is not, then, any mutability or weakness in those occasional interpositions which seem to us to suspend the laws and to alter the course of nature. The Almighty Being, who called the universe out of nothing, whose creating hand gave a beginning to the course of nature, and whose will must be independent of that which he himself produced, acts for wise ends, and at particular seasons, not in that manner which he has enabled us to trace, but in another manner concerning which he has not furnished us with the means of forming any expectation, and which is resolvable merely into his good pleasure. The one manner is his ordinary administration, under which his reasonable offspring enjoy security, advance in the knowledge of nature, and receive much instruction. The other manner is his extraordinary administration, which, although foreseen by him as part of the scheme of his government, appears strange to his intelligent creatures, but which, by this strangeness, may promote purposes to them most important and salutary. It may rouse their attention to the natural proofs of the being and perfections of God. It may afford a practical confutation of the skepticism and materialism to which false philosophy often leads, and, rebuking the pride and the security of man, may teach the nations to know that the Lord God reigneth, quote, in heaven and in earth, in the seas, and all deep places, end quote. Footnote, Psalm 135, verse 6, end footnote. To such moral purposes as these, any alteration of the course of nature by the immediate interposition of the Almighty may be subservient, and no man will presume to say that our limited faculties can assign all the reasons which may induce the Almighty thus to interpose. But we can clearly discern one most important end which may be promoted by those alterations of the course of nature, in which the agency of men or other visible ministers of the divine power is employed. The circumstances of the intelligent creation may render it highly expedient that, in addition to that original revelation of the nature and the will of God which they enjoy by the light of reason, there should be superadded an extraordinary revelation to remove the errors which had obscured their knowledge, to enforce the practice of their duty, or to revive and extend their hopes. The wisest ancient philosophers wished for a divine revelation, and to anyone who examines the state of the old heathen world in respect of religion and morality, it cannot appear unworthy of the Father of his creatures to bestow such a blessing. This revelation, supposing it to be given, may either be imparted to every individual mind, or be confined to a few chosen persons, vested with the commission to communicate the benefits of it to the rest of the world. It is certainly possible for the Father of Spirits to act upon every individual mind, so as to give that mind the impression of an extraordinary revelation. It is as easy for the Father of Spirits to do this as to act upon a few minds. But in this case, departures from the established course of nature would be multiplied without end. In the illumination of every individual, there would be an immediate extraordinary interposition of the Almighty. But extraordinary interpositions so frequent would lose their nature, so as to be confounded with the ordinary light of reason and conscience. Or if they were so striking as to be, in every case, clearly discriminated, they would subdue the understanding and overawe the whole soul, so as to extort by the feeling of the immediate presence of the Creator that submission and obedience which it is the character of a rational agent to yield with deliberation and from choice. It appears, therefore, more consistent with the simplicity of nature, and with the character of man, that a few persons should be ordained the instruments of conveying a divine revelation to their fellow creatures, and that the extraordinary circumstances which must attend the giving such a revelation should be confined to them. But it is not enough that these persons feel the impression of a divine revelation upon their own minds. It is not enough that in their communications with their fellow creatures they appear to be possessed of superior knowledge and more enlarged views. It is possible that their knowledge and views may have been derived from some natural source, and we require a clear, indisputable mark to authenticate the singular and important commission which they profess to bear. It were presumptuous in us to say what are the marks of such a commission which the Almighty can give, for our knowledge of what He can do is chiefly derived from our observation of what He has done. But we may say that, according to our experience of the divine procedure, there can be no mark of a divine commission more striking and more incontrovertible than that the persons who bear it should have the privilege of altering the course of nature by a word of their mouths. The revelation made to their minds is invisible, and all the outward appearances of it may be delusive. But extraordinary works, beyond the power of man, performed by them, are a sensible outward sign of a power which can be derived from God alone. If He has invested them with this power, it is not incredible that He has made a revelation to their minds, and if they constantly appeal to the works, which are the sign of the power, as the evidence of the invisible revelation, and of the commission with which it was accompanied, then we must either believe that they have such a commission, or we are driven to the horrid supposition that God is the author of a falsehood, and conspires with these men to deceive His creatures." End quote. Dr. Hill's is the usual view of the nature of a miracle. Paley does not seem to think a formal definition necessary. If one is wanted, we venture to give the following, in italics. A miracle is an event beyond the power of man to effect, and is brought about for the purpose of furnishing mankind with a revelation from God, or of fulfilling something foretold in a former revelation, or of furthering the ends and objects of a divine revelation in some way or other. End of italics. This definition appears to clear us of all controversy on the question of natural laws, and whether or not a miracle suspends or contravenes them. It may often be difficult or impossible for us to tell when a law of nature is suspended or contravened, but we can determine with sufficient accuracy and certainty how far the exertion of human powers can go. On that ground, Paley rests the question, and rests it, we think, with abundant safety. It is, moreover, the ground assumed by the Bible itself. This definition also includes the proper occasion of miracles, which were not afforded except in cases where they were absolutely necessary. It likewise implies that everything laying claim to the authority of a miracle, but tending in any degree to oppose or contradict the declarations of a prior revelation, must be an imposture. God cannot contradict Himself. Now that we have done with these preliminary matters, we shall have much less to do in the way of appendix and annotation for some time to come. The historical evidence is so strong that the adversary betakes himself to metaphysics in order to destroy its foundations. In conclusion, we beg to recommend the prize essay on infidelity by the Reverend Thomas Pearson, Carter and Brothers, 1854, as a popular, eloquent, and masterly exposé of unbelief in its various aspects, causes, and agencies. It examines nearly every phase of the subject: atheism, pantheism, naturalism, spiritualism, indifferentism, formalism, and secularism. This is a formidable array. But Mr. Pearson solves the mystery of these names, and handles the questions involved in them with singular skill and fervor. McCosh and Pearson are noble associates in the same school of theology, The Venerable Wardlaw also discusses the opinions concerning miracles held by spiritualists, mythists, and rationalists. The American reader must recollect that the new philosophy called spiritualism has no connection whatever with spirit rappings, and alleged spiritual communications ab extra, which distinguish another new school of revelationists. Editor. End of Preparatory Considerations.